we have an apostasy problem when one young person chooses to leave the Lord and forsake His church. And we seem to have an apostasy epidemic today with so many of our young people leaving the Lord. And why is that true? The short answer, I guess, is I don't know. In other words, I don't have any great expertise on this subject. I'm not a youth minister. I'm not a child psychologist. But I do think, by virtue of just some anecdotal evidence that I have, perhaps I can say some things that will be constructive on this topic. Now, there are several ways I feel like I could go about addressing the topic. One would be to revisit all the biblical passages that deal with how to retain the faith of young people as they grow and how to establish confidence in religion with young people, and that would be a beneficial study. I recommend that to you. I'm not going to do that today, although we will, by necessity, touch on some of those passages. Another way I could go about dealing with the topic would be to review some of the very helpful Bible-based literature that our brotherhood has produced over the years. And I'm very thankful, Brother Wade, that we haven't ignored this topic in the past. So much good material has been written by our faithful brethren over the years, and I appreciate that. And I commend that to you. If you look at the manuscript of my little talk today in the book, you will find some of those articles and some of those books in the works cited. So I would commend you to look at those things. But I've chosen a third approach, and that is to give you some counterfactual statements. That is, some if-then type statements from my own experience to help us see some of those safeguards that would keep, hopefully, young people from leaving the Lord. I've chosen to talk about my own experience, not because I feel like my own experience is anything special or anything unique, but simply because I know my own experience better than anybody else's. And so this will be rather personal. I want to give 3 of these, and the first of these is this. If my mother had not been present to answer questions that I had about religion, then if I had left the faith, then her absence would help explain why I had left. Now, this is one of those external safeguards, and all the safeguards we're going to discuss today are of an external nature. We could just as well talk about some of the internal safeguards, such as purity of heart. You know, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8 instructs us to have purity of heart. We could talk about a number of those things. But this is an external safeguard. This was something that was external to me that helped me, and all of those that we talk about will be of this nature. Furthermore, I want to make the point before we even get too far into our main observations that just because I'm talking about some of these external safeguards does not mean that someone's salvation hinges on whether these safeguards are present or absent. I'm going to be responsible for my actions before God whether or not any of these external safeguards are present. So I want to make everyone aware of that by way of disclaimer or kind of clearing the ground before we get into this main discussion. So, number 1 is this, however. If my mother had been absent and I had left the Lord, then that would have largely explained why I left. Now, fathers are important too. And in my opinion, my father is just about the best there is. But I'm going to talk about my mother at this particular moment because when I was growing up and at the time when my faith was being established, it was my mother who was the primary caregiver for Hannah and myself. And so I was going to be asking her a lot of the questions. I asked my dad a lot of questions too, but I could take you back to the very room in the restaurant in Jasper, Alabama, where I asked my mother when I was about 10 years old, how is it that we know that the Bible is anything special? I mean, we usually say that the Bible is from God, but the Bible has a lot of stories in it, and we got a lot of storybooks at home. So why is the Bible any different? Well, how do we know that the Bible is anything different? And she answered that question and gave me some further suggestions for where I could look, and here's some more answers to that. Well, what if it hadn't been my mother who was there to answer the question for me, but what if it had been someone else? What if it had been a babysitter or something? Now, we had some great babysitters growing up, but I'm mainly thankful that my mother was there to be the one to answer that question. And that my mother and father were very attentive, but especially in the day and age when so many mothers aren't at home to help their children understand the answers to these questions, that my mother was. I want to say this and be very, very clear. It was a dynamic process and an organic process that happened spontaneously and at random moments. It wasn't a thing where we were going to schedule 15 minutes to talk about apologetics in a couple of weeks or something like that. It wasn't where we sat down and made out our calendar and said, okay, we're going to spend some time talking about the inspiration of the Bible in a couple of days. And let's do that at 6:30 on Thursday. It doesn't work that way with me. It probably doesn't work that way with most kids who are 9 or 10 years old. No, questions that I had just arose spontaneously. It was dynamic, and the reason that those questions could be answered properly is because my mother was already there. She was taking the time, and that was a great sacrifice, I suppose, in many cases. But I'm very thankful. In addition to my own story, I want to read an example. And I know it's probably real annoying to be read to you, but I just think this is so good. This is from a book called God, A Philosophical Preface to Faith. And we happened to be reading this in one of my classes the other day. And this is written by an apologist for Christianity in general. He's not a member of our faith, but he is writing from what we would call a general Christian perspective. And he's making a different point from what I'm making today. But in the process of making his point about defending the existence of God from against those who would say that God doesn't exist, he talked about how a child learns to talk about God. And this is just a very plain example, but very helpful to me. And I think this could probably express what I mean as well as anything I could say. Daddy brought home a dozen donuts. Each member of the family was entitled to 2 of them. The little boy took 2 donuts and put them on the table at his place. Finally, it was time to eat them. If we are very careful when we eat the donuts to save the holes in the middle, one of the older children teased, Daddy can take them back and get free donuts. The little boy knew what free meant. He began to eat his first donut very carefully. Soon there was only a thin ring of crust left. He was quite pleased with himself. Here's a hole. Oh no, you have to eat all the donut and save the hole. You haven't eaten it all yet. The little boy ate carefully, but as he finished the last of the donut, the hole was all gone too. He took his second donut and tried again. You got to be more careful. You weren't careful enough last time and you lost the hole. He ate very, very carefully, but as he finished the donut, the hole vanished with it. He was frustrated. When you eat all of the donut, the hole goes away too, he said with some irritation, realizing he had been kidded. Everyone laughed. After dinner, the little boy watched the sun go down again, and he was thinking about what Mom said about God. Mama, if God gets tired out, won't the sun fall down fast like a shooting star and get burned up like a cinder? God never gets tired out, she said. He doesn't have to work to make the sun go down the way he wants to. He just thinks how it should be, and it does what he wants. The little boy thought about this for a while. When he thought how he wanted something to be, it didn't get to be that way. And Daddy would talk about how something should be, as when the grass needed to be cut. But then one of the bigger boys had to go cut it. If God made things the way He wanted just by thinking about them, would they stay that way if He went to sleep? Mama, you remember the hole in the donut? Yes, she said. It went away when you ate the donut all up because there really isn't anything there. You said God makes things the way He wants just by thinking about them. But when He goes to sleep, why don't things go away like the hole in the donut? Because God doesn't go to sleep. He doesn't have a body like we do. We get sleepy because our bodies get tired out, but God doesn't have a body. He just thinks, so He never gets sleepy. God doesn't have a body? No, and that's why we can't see Him. But He is right here with us all the time. The little boy thought about this for many days. God must be like the wind. You can't see the wind, but it's there. Even inside the house, if you run fast, you can feel the wind. And if you blow hard on your hand, you can feel the wind you make. God must be like the wind. He's here with us, but He doesn't have a body, so we can't see Him. That's what the little boy thought. The little boy thought about this for some time. God is not there. He's not like the hole in the donut. If everyone ate all the animals and insects and trees and the flowers were dead, God would not be there either. Just like that hole in the donut, which goes away when you eat up the donut. Mama, if everyone and all the animals and insects and trees and flowers were dead, God wouldn't be there anymore, would He? Yes, He would. You know, He makes them all to be just by thinking. He makes the sun to set and lets the shooting stars fall just by thinking. A long time ago, there were no people or any living things, but God thought and wanted them, and there they came to be. A long, long time ago, before God made living things, there were no stars, there was no sun. The ground and the sky were not here, but God always was. And He thought of all He wanted to be, all that He wanted to exist, and everything started and came to be as He wanted it to be. Then God is not like that hole in the donut. No, she laughed. The hole in the donut isn't really something there. We only think about the hole because the donut is there. And it's the same with the wind. God's not like the wind. But the hole doesn't make the donut be there. We think of God because we see the stars and sun and people and living things and the wind and everything there is. God makes everything there by thinking of it and wanting it. He is real, and He always was before anything else came to be, and He always will be. Now, what if the questions like that about donuts and wind and random little things that don't usually come into the minds of adults, what if those things that prompted those questions in the mind of little Germaine Grisey, who wrote that book, what if the mother who answered those questions in that particular way had not been there and it had been someone else, and then he grew up and went to graduate school or something? What do you think his belief system would look like? Would it be a belief system that would have led him to write a book as beneficial as this one that he has written? Or might he be an atheist? Or might he be a skeptic or something like that? It was the attention that was paid to him by somebody who might not have known much more about science than what a hole in a donut is. Might not have known any more about science than just some rudimentary facts about wind or something like that, but was there. And the presence was absolutely essential. But my conclusion about this is not surprising, because we already have Titus chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. So we knew this already. I'm not telling you anything you didn't know. But as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine, that the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, in love, in patience. The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers or keepers at home, or workers at home, depending on what translation you're using, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. Now, maybe the most controversial word in the Bible is that word translated homekeepers or watchdogs of the home or workers at home, or however you translate it in your particular version. Because people don't want to hear that. They would rather be able to go out, and for the most part, I know there are some hard circumstances where sometimes people can't have the mother in the home stay and rear the children. But I fear for the most part, the reason that the mothers don't do this is because we have a warped view of luxury. Our view of luxury is, let's go see how many material things we can collect, and the most luxurious thing we can provide for our children is the time and the presence of the mother in the home. That's true from my experience. Now again, I haven't done a lot of surveys about this. I don't have a lot of training in this area or empirical evidence. All I have is the Bible and my own experience. So you're going to have to take the Bible. Don't worry about my own experience, but take the Bible. Now the best summary of what the word translated keepers at home that I've ever read is this. And you can look up the references in the manuscript if you want to. Listen to this. And I hate to read to you again, but this is a powerful explanation of this word. The Greek word translated keepers at home is oikuros. The word is derived from two Greek words. The first, oikos, means a house, a dwelling, or by metonymy, a household or family. The second, uros, refers to a keeper, a watcher, a guardian, i.e. one who has the oversight and responsibility for something. Thus, the basic significance of oikuros is that of a housekeeper. That is, one who watches over a household and family, seeing to it that all members are cared for, and that all things are maintained in good order. Oikuros is used only in the New Testament in Titus 2:5, the verse we just read. Therefore, in seeking to accurately discern its meaning, we must look to the Greek literature of the New Testament era. In other words, we don't have another place in the Bible to look and compare this to. We've got to look and see how people used it in the day that the Bible was written. Okay, so what did they say? It was employed in reference, let's see, there, in that era, the word oikuros meant watching or keeping the house. It was employed in reference to a watchdog and to a rooster, but more germane to the context of Titus 2:5, oikuros also meant keeping at home, and it was employed as a substantive housekeeper to indicate the mistress of the house. Furthermore, it was specifically used in praise of a good wife. Interestingly, oikuros is utilized contemporaneously of a man who refused to go out to war, designating him as... Okay, everybody just kind of pause what you're doing and listen to what I'm about to say. Designating him as a stay-at-home man because he wasn't going out to war. I'll just pause for a minute and let that kind of, sink in. The verbal form, or curio, meant to watch or keep the house. It was used of women to indicate those who were at home, to watch over the affairs of a household, and of men to designate those who stayed at home to avoid military service. Other closely related words, such as okurima, meant keeping the house and staying at home, and was used to refer to women as the stay-at-homes. Okuria referred to women as those who employed in the work of housekeeping. Okurios meant the wages or reward for the work of keeping the house, but also designated specifically keeping children within the door of the house, keeping them at home, I suppose, as opposed to, playing in the road or something like that. So I'm going to move on to the next point now. So the first one was if my mother hadn't been there, and I had left the Lord, then her absence would explain why I left. It doesn't mean I couldn't have grown up to be faithful if she had gone. But by the grace of God, thankfully she was around and was able to help me. Number two, if my parents and other faithful brethren had not encouraged me to ask questions and had not been appreciative when I did ask questions about religion, but had instead turned me away and acted as though I shouldn't ask questions, and then I had left the Lord, then their refusal to help spark my interest and encourage me to be inquisitive would help explain why I left. Now, I want to first say about this point that I believe in the sufficiency of the Scriptures. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3 says that we have all things that pertain to life and godliness. We've got that faith that was once and delivered, according to Jude 3, and we must live by it. All things must be done in the name of Jesus Christ, Colossians 3:17, or by His authority. And so, we're not saying that by being inquisitive that we're wanting to forsake the Word, but we're talking about asking questions about why we believe what we believe. And so many good people encouraged me to ask these kinds of questions and were helpful to me. And so the fact that I've remained faithful instead of letting these questions trouble me and driving me away perhaps if I had gotten the wrong answers from someone else or if I had just thought that Christianity wasn't tenable or something like that, that would help explain why I had left. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 21, I believe, prescribes this kind of process. Because it says we've got to test all things and hold to that which is good. So testing all things doesn't just mean comparing one Bible verse to another. That may be part of it. But it also means looking at the Bible concepts and saying, how can we defend this? How can we address people who are critical of this passage? Is it reasonable to believe in what the Bible says? And I'm thankful again that our brotherhood has done a good job over the years producing materials that deal with this. But I'm afraid sometimes some preachers have looked at this idea of the all-sufficiency of the Scriptures, in which I have just said we firmly believe, but then have said something like this. Well, the Scriptures are all-sufficient, so what we don't need to do is do any philosophy. And I think usually what they mean by that is good. I think usually they mean that we shouldn't believe in the doctrines of any particular philosopher. We need to believe in what Jesus said and follow Him, because it's His words, John 12 and 48, that will judge us in the last day. It's His words that will never pass away, according to Luke 21 and verse 33. All that's true. But I'm afraid sometimes we get the idea, if we talk like that, to say something like this. We shouldn't be inquirers, or we shouldn't ask reasonable questions. Of course we should. We should be critical thinkers. I think that's what Peter prescribed in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, when he said that we should be always ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within us. That's involving the reasoning process. It's not just including quoting Bible verses, but also the reasoning process about what the Bible says. Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 18 is where God invites us to do that process. Come and let us reason together, saith the Lord. There's a philosopher in British Columbia named Colin MacLeod. And he has prescribed something called Socratic nurturing. And now he happens to be an atheist. He's not on our side. But I think the idea that he has prescribed in the terms of Socratic nurturing is biblical, because all he's saying, in essence, and he is careful to say, you could Socratically nurture your child and the child grow up and be a Christian. It's not pertaining to either atheism or religion as things turn out. The idea is rearing children who are inquirers. So let's go back to that occasion when I asked my mother, how do we know the Bible's from God? If she had said, well, the Bible says it's from God. that would be, in a sense, a good answer. That would be a profound answer. I mean, it is true that the Bible is the Bible's own best commentary. Have you heard that before? I firmly believe that. Every time I study the Bible, it seems like the Bible is more and more its own best commentary. The Bible does teach that the Bible's inspired. And that's important because if it didn't, well, that would be a bad sign as far as inspiration is concerned. It would really seem like the Bible is not inspired if it became clear that the Bible writers didn't even think that they were putting down the words of God. So that's a really important point. But if she had just said that, or if she had just said something like, well, we believe it because we believe it, you see, that shuts down my questioning. That's a method of causing me to cease asking questions about that topic and to cease learning about it. Instead, her answer was something like, that's a really good question, and there are some really good reasons about this, and let's go and study about this, and I think we can learn as we go. I didn't get either of those first two answers, one of which is just silly and one is profound but not complete. The first silly answer is, we believe it because we believe it. That doesn't help. That's a tautology. It doesn't help. But then the second answer is profound but insufficient in a sense that I just described a moment ago. We believe it because the Bible says it. Because that just begs the question. The question we were asking is, how do we know the Bible is right when it says it? And so we need to go and do some searching about that. I hope we see what I mean when we say that we need to rear children who are Socratic in the sense that they're inquisitors, that they have inquiring minds and they want to learn these answers, and that we propel them to do this rather than sometimes shutting down the question-asking process. This also requires, if we're going to start encouraging them to ask these questions, I'm not insinuating that we don't ever already, of course we do, but if we're going to make this our practice, we're going to have to get ready ourselves and make sure we're prepared to provide some of these answers, or at least point them in the right direction. And sometimes I feel like we might not be as prepared as we ought to be. But that's our fault because the resources are out there. Now let's turn to the third one. The last one has to do with youth ministry. If my parents had not insisted upon our family being more important in my life than the youth program or the youth ministry, and had not protected me from some of the influences in the youth group, and then I had left the Lord, then their failure to work in that regard, or their failure to prioritize in that way, would help explain why I left. Now, I think youth ministries generally have a lot of good to do, and there is a lot of good that is done by the youth ministries. And I loved a lot of the youth activities I participated in. I'm thinking back of a trip to Six Flags and to go see the Atlanta Braves play that I really enjoyed. That's one of my great memories from childhood, was going with my youth group and watching the Atlanta Braves play and going to Six Flags together. That was so much fun, and I'm so glad I did it. We grew closer together. We had devotionals as we went. We also did a lot of service things too. But I just will always remember that one moment, sitting up in a stadium that's no longer there, with all of my friends, watching the Braves play, and thinking this is just about as good as life gets here at a baseball game with my friends. And I was 12 years old, and Braves baseball was about the biggest thing, right under Alabama football. It was right there. It was pretty important. Kind of like, well, I'm in the wrong place to say things like that. Anyway, what we were doing was important, I think. And so I'm not disparaging the idea of doing youth work and having youth events and these kinds of things. And I had youth ministers who I loved and respected and grew from my association with them. And so I want to clear that ground again before I say this. But I want to say this. I'm not sure if we always know exactly what we mean when we talk about youth ministry. I think there are so many good youth ministers who do so many good things and are so beneficial in the kingdom. But if I were to try to define what it is, it would be hard because of that diversity, because they're doing so many different things. And so I think it would be fruitful for us, just for a few minutes, kind of as a thought experiment, to step back from it and look upon what we're doing as an expedient. And that's what youth ministry is. It's an expedient to accomplish some things that are commanded in the Scriptures. And so it's authorized by the principle of expediency. I believe that. And that would be another lesson. We could talk about that at length. But I do believe it's authorized in that sense. But we need to step back sometimes from our expedients and ask if they are as expedient as we think they are, and how could we adjust them perhaps to be more expedient. And so I'm reflecting on my own experience with youth groups and thinking, about youth ministers I knew from college not too long ago when I was at Freed-Hardeman, and other youth ministers I've gotten to know and how they're working and what they're doing, and just kind of taking a moment to sigh and say, let's think about this carefully. I think I want to put the argument up there now. Could you go to I think the next slide is called the argument. Okay. Let's say this about youth ministry as just a way of clarifying what we mean. Let us say the typical goal of a youth group is to bring young people closer to the Lord, and that this is typically accomplished through the general avenues of 1, Bible study, 2, service, and 3, Christian fellowship. Now this could be more precise, and I know that it could be extended. This is just kind of a rough and ready definition. It's almost the first thing that came off the top of my head. It's not necessarily essential that these 3 particular things be our definition. I'm just going to, for the sake of argument, say that. Now, I think these are good things that the Bible commands us to do. 1 Peter 2:15 tells us to study, to show ourselves approved unto God. There are all sorts of passages that tell us that we should fellowship with one another. 1 John 1:7 comes to mind. And we all know that we've got to be about service. Matthew 25:31-45 says that at the judgment day, one of those things that we will be judged for, and one of those things that Jesus takes so seriously, is our service. And so that's essential to remember that. So those are 3 things that are essential. And you may disagree a little bit by wanting to add something or take away something from my definition or make it more precise. That's great. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this is what youth groups should do by these 3 methods. Okay, so that's A. Now let's go to B. Scripture assigns goals 1 to 3 in A above, which we just saw, among other goals, to the church as a whole, and not particularly to youth groups. Okay? Or youth ministries as we've set them up. Okay? So this is the responsibility of the church as a whole. It's not just a responsibility of youth groups, but it's something that all of us should be doing. And the youth group can help kids to do this. That's an expedient that we're going to use to help young people carry out these responsibilities. Young Christians. We're going to get them organized to help them do it together because we think it'll go better that way, and so forth. So very good. That's the expediency. Where did it go? Now, you will recall we made those points already. We're going to go to C. Okay. He's holding up his finger as in, wait just a minute. Okay. Now this is our theme for the lesson. Okay. Now we're going to go on. There you go. A, B. Now C. I'm just going to read it to you, and it may show up on the screen eventually. The accomplishments of goals 1 to 3, those goals about Bible study and service and fellowship, the accomplishment of those goals in our lives, in the lives of young people. And of course, this is still within the church. These goals are assigned to the church as a whole, but young people, as they are Christians, are a part of the church. Inasmuch as they are Christians, they are a part of the church. And these goals are assigned, in particularly, we want to say now, to their own Christian parents, to cultivate these ideas in them. Ephesians 6 comes to mind, Titus 2 that we already read, 1 Timothy 2, and other passages in the book of Proverbs, a lot of different passages, assign these kinds of goals to parents. Okay, so we've gotten the picture now that here's some goals that we have for our young people, but these goals are not just assigned to young people, but to the whole church. And then, specifically within the church, the parents have the special responsibility of cultivating these ideals in the lives of the young people. That's the status of the argument at this point. So here's the next point, letter D in our argument. At most, a youth program should be the parent's tool to accomplish their goal. You got it? At most, the youth program should be the parent's tool to accomplish their goals. And if any youth program weakens or pressurizes the relationship between young people and their parents, the youth program, as it is organized, should at least be suspect. If it pressurizes the relationship between the people who are supposed to be leading the young people to these goals, 1 to 3, that we mentioned above, if the youth program is stressing or putting undue pressure on the relationship between those folks, those parents, and the kids, the people they're trying to lead to accomplish goals 1 to 3 above, then we got to reevaluate. We got to say, can we do better? Can we do it differently? So letter E, which you may never see in your whole life, sadly, but it's in your book. You know, can I put a plug in for the lectureship book? Buy the lectureship book. You got points D and E in there, so go look at that. So letter E is, we should re-examine youth ministry as it is currently practiced in order to make it more conducive to helping parents accomplish their God-given objective of rearing faithful children. So I've said, here's what it ought to do, and we need to reevaluate. Now, the obvious question that I've opened up is, what about it? What about youth ministry as we're currently practicing it makes it so that my last point is correct, that my conclusion is right, that we should reevaluate it? And then, if we should reevaluate it, what should we do to try to fix it? To fix what may have gone wrong at some point. And in some cases, not maybe in all cases, but in cases where it might not be as strong as it can be, what can we do? The answer to the first part, which is why should we reevaluate, I think has several parts. And you could probably add to this list. I'm not omniscient about all this stuff. You can probably do even better than I am. But let's first say this. First, we're losing a lot of children to the world. That's what I started this lesson by saying is, souls are valuable, Matthew 16:26, valuable than anything else, more valuable than anything else in the world, and we're losing them. We're losing a lot of them. And I don't know when we started maybe losing more of our youth than we're losing now, but I think the reason Brother Wade asked me to do this lesson today is because we're losing more of them than we used to be. So even if someone thinks that we're getting our youth ministry exactly right as we're doing it now, should still be open to asking questions about how should we do it differently because we're losing so many of the kids. Again, it's not my empirical study, it's just my anecdotal evidence. But then secondly, I think there might be a disjunct in some cases between how youth ministers are being trained to do their jobs and then the way they actually are expected to do their jobs. I remember when I was in school, I had to take a youth ministry course. I got to take a youth ministry course. And I read the textbook. And after I had finished reading it, I was scared to death of youth ministry because I thought it was so hard that I could never do it. It was a thing where it really required you to be like a psychologist and a family therapist, a counselor, however you want to phrase it, and a really great Bible student at the same time. And then have kind of a great personality, which I never have really had. And so I was thinking, this is something I will never be able to do. And then I'm not so sure if we're training youth ministers usually to do the kinds of jobs that they're always asked to do. I think there may be a disjunct. I don't know to what degree that's true, but in my case, I was kind of scared away from youth ministry because of the book I read and because of talking to some people who talked about the perils of it. And how hard it is, and how much I would be expected to do that I wasn't. I was like, well, I'm not training for that. I don't have 4 more years to spend in school to work on that, as opposed to what I'm already working on. And so that's just a general observation I've had. Thirdly, the structure of some of our youth ministry programs seems to pressurize the relationship between parents and children. I think this is true. I think sometimes we have occasions where kids think, my parents are not cool, but the youth minister is cool. And I get to be myself when I'm with the youth group, but when I'm at home, my parents make me do chores. And my parents bind me to rules and obligations. And I don't like it. And so I don't want to talk about stuff that's important to me with them because they're kind of out to get me. They're kind of authoritarians. I don't think they really like me that much. And the youth minister likes me. I'm telling you, we get along great. And we like the same kind of music. And we like to go to the same kinds of places. That's not true about my parents. You know, I like this current band. My dad likes John Denver. You know, it's a problem. And all these kinds of things, over time, there's discipline at home. Maybe they think less discipline in the youth group. And so they like that better. Here's a quote I've written out that maybe could summarize the way they feel. We're mostly stuck here at home or at school where we have to do chores and homework and be constantly nice and respectful to people older than us. Doesn't sound very fun. Then, every week or so, we get to hang out with our youth minister and the youth group and be who we really are. We have more fun with them. The youth minister is closer to us than our own age, and he really understands us. He doesn't tell us what to do very much. He gives us our freedom and doesn't make us work like Mom and Dad do. When we're with the youth group, we watch movies, hang out at the mall, and we also talk about spiritual stuff on our own terms. And when we're with the youth minister, we can ask questions about things that really matter. At home, we're not so comfortable talking about things. And then I want to suggest that sometimes in youth groups there are negative influences that go unchecked because of the way the youth group is set up. even if all of the elders and all of the youth ministers and all of the parents, all of the deacons who are involved are faithful Christians and want to see it go well, sometimes there's a bad influence in the youth group that goes unchecked because perhaps the youth minister who's involved doesn't feel like he is older enough than the young people who are in the group and doesn't feel like he is in charge enough, perhaps. I saw that happen when I was growing up, where there were negative influences and the youth minister didn't feel like he was in a position where he could easily or comfortably or whatever deal with some of those things. And some of those problems would be different, I think, if parents were around, if it were the parents. And so, just to be brief, I think my solution is that parents need to be the youth ministers. I think my conclusion of all this is parents are the youth ministers. Mark DeVries has written a book called Family-Based Youth Ministry, and his argument is parents need to get involved in the youth ministry. I appreciate his sentiment there. He has a whole chapter on how important parents are. My response is, no, it's not that parents need to get involved in the youth ministry. It's that parents need to be the youth ministry, and they need to be in charge of it. It's kind of like for a youth minister or some elders who are having a youth ministry to say, let's let the parents be involved in the youth ministry, to me, it's like saying, it's like some lower level employees saying, let's let the CEOs come to work today. The CEOs should be in charge. And then if you want to have a youth minister who helps them to do their job, maybe he helps the parents to organize some things, or maybe he buys the Kool-Aid, or maybe he buys the airplane tickets, or maybe, I don't know what all he does, but maybe there's somebody who needs to be kind of a secretary like that to organize those kinds of events that the parents plan together. And the parents are there, and the parents are overseeing all that. Maybe that's a job that someone who's called a youth minister should do. But I think there's another opportunity for youth ministers that they're not getting the chance to do very often because we don't set up their preparation this way. What if all of the youth ministers, instead of doing the kind of preparation that they very often do now, did two things? And this, I think, could be an excellent role for all the guys who want to be youth ministers. Is get training in Bible, first of all, because anybody who's going to be giving young people advice about spiritual things needs to know the Bible. But then secondly, what if he goes and gets training in counseling? Because then, have you heard about the problems that our kids are facing? Like depression. My dad has given a lesson at Polishing the Pulpit about cutting, about self-mutilation. And then the pornography issues and homosexuality issues and all sorts of issues that I don't even understand are at the forefront of the minds of many of our young people. What if all of our youth ministers got training in counseling and could deal with some of those problems that, Brother Wade, I just don't feel like I'm ever going to be competent enough to deal with on a deep level. If somebody is really deeply involved in some of these issues, as many young people today are, my parents, I hate to keep using my parents as examples, but my parents deal with questions from parents very regularly who contact them and say, look, here's what my kid is into. What can I do? And you know what? It's too late very often to make real inroads into those problems because nobody has been attentive to that in a serious way in the past. But what if all of a sudden, just imagine a possible world where all the youth ministers that we had been trained very thoroughly in the Bible and counseling. What a difference that would make. And what a valuable role that could fulfill. And somebody says, well, the kids would never get together if they didn't have a standard youth minister like we very often have today, if we don't have somebody who does all that. Well, can the parents not plan a devotional? I don't know what to say to a parent who says, Caleb, we couldn't do your plan because we can't do that stuff. Can a parent plan a trip to Mexico to hand out tracts to people? What is the youth minister? He's probably a parent who happened to maybe get some training in that area, but does he have a lot more expertise on travel to Mexico than a parent does? Maybe he happened to get a special class in travel to Mexico. I don't know. But why can't parents do that? Somebody says the kids won't ever get together if you don't have a standard kind of youth ministry like we've always had. Well, I did. I was at a congregation where we didn't have a youth minister, and we did all that. We did a lot of things, but it was parents and deacons and different elders, preachers, who organized all that stuff, and we got together. Believe it or not, we did fun things together. And again, I want you to hear what I said. I didn't say youth ministers are bad guys or that they're not doing anything good. I think they are doing a lot of good. I'm just asking about the system as a whole, and could we kind of turn it in a way so that everybody who's working to help our young people could do it in a more effective way. I know of a church, I'm thinking of a congregation right now, that doesn't have a youth minister, but has a youth group that is better organized than any I have ever seen before. And it's because there's a deacon who kind of sees over some books and sees over some financing like a fund that they have to do some youth events. But it's all parent-driven. I mean, the parents are the ones who are getting ideas to do these events, and the parents are the ones who are all having them over to their house and all this. It's parents who are driving it. I need to quit. By the grace of God, I did not become a prodigal. Now, I've made a lot of mistakes, but I never did become a prodigal. But I want you to know the main reason I think that I didn't was because of people who were around me who were helping see that I didn't. Now, this doesn't just include my parents, but it includes youth groups and youth ministers and entire universities of people who have helped me to grow in many, many ways. And I continue to be thankful to them and for the grace and mercy that God has shown to me. And I hope it wasn't too annoying for you to have to listen to some of my little personal anecdotes. And I hope that we've been constructive as we've tried to think about how to serve the young people in the kingdom better during this hour. Thank you very much.